Welcome to Mystere Creations. I'm your host AJ, and we're talking to Marc and Steve, who run the Port Angeles Underground Heritage Tours. They have a wealth of knowledge about the history of Port Angeles, and have both served their country and still do in upkeeping this important historic tour. Please join us for a conversation about Port Angeles and its underground. Usually I basically say, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and what you do? In this case, there's two of you. Can you both tell me a little bit about yourselves and what you do?
Okay, I'll start. I'm Mark Abshire. I'm the executive director of the Port Angeles Chamber of Commerce. I've been here for about 6 years. I grew up in Port Townsend, not too far from here, and then I had a career all around the world, really, with the United States Air Force, and ended up in Washington D.C. Working for. After I retired, I worked for a bunch of corporations. My last job was with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting in D.C. And then what I really wanted to do was live back here on this beautiful North Atlantic Peninsula. It was a goal for me for most of my life, was to get back here. So I finally found a way to get back here, and it's to running the Chamber of Commerce was my way of getting back here. So I'm really delighted to be here. I'm excited about it. I love this community. I love where I live. I love hopping over to Victoria once in a while, and just everything about being here is very great. So that's a little bit my background.
There we go. Thank you. Port Angeles is, I think, the best example of an American town that I've ever seen, and people are warm and friendly. So when you go there, it's great.
Yeah, we love it. It's pretty unique. It's a unique place. It's sandwiched between, mile high alpine mountains and the ocean. And for example, we run a recycling event every year, first Sunday in August, called Ride the Hurricane, where the cyclists go from sea level to a mile high in about 17 miles. It's a hill climb, basically. Yep. And part of that is we have a land promontory that goes out from a sandbar, basically. It goes out and sort of circles the harbor. And on the end of that is a Coast Guard station. If you go all the way out to the Coast Guard station, you're a mile and a half out to sea, basically. So some of our cyclists for that event, they actually go out to the station and then turn around and come back and go climb the hill to the top of Hurricane Ridge. And you go from a mile and a half out to sea to a mile high in about 20 miles. And so there just isn't any place, I don't think, in the United States, if not the world, where you can have a cycling event like that. It's pretty unique.
That's awesome.
So
world class.
Yeah. We get a lot of Victoria and Canadian cyclists for that event every year too.
Yeah. I noticed that.
Yeah. Over to Steve.
All right. My name is Steve Hargis, and I as well love it here. I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan, and joined the Coast Guard and did 30 years in the Coast Guard. But I got stationed here in 2000. And when I got stationed here, the first thing I did when I got off the plane was, because I flew in and it was such a beautiful day and I saw all the mountains, was I went right to a real estate agent and bought a house. And I knew I was never going to leave here. My career took me other places, but I got my house and came back as soon as I retired in 2013. I love history. My last tour in Boston, history was pretty incredible. The first of everything happened in Boston.
Yeah.
But here is it's unbelievable, the amount of history. And we're going to go over some of that today.
Yes.
But I absolutely love it here and never want to leave. I made that decision the day I got here.
you can buy a house right away off the airplane because Coast Guard folks make more money than Air Force folks.
Yeah.
So they got a lot of money in the Coast Guard.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, keep telling
Yeah, right.
Yep. Can you give us a little history about the indigenous who first lived in the area?
I absolutely can. It's one of my favorite topics. They've been here for, some people estimate 40,000 years, but at least 13,000 for sure, from radiocarbon dating. But they originally came over, probably more than likely, from Asia, Siberia specifically, on a land bridge that was created hundreds of thousands of years ago, and then really exposed about 40,000. So that's where they got the number 40,000 years for when they came over. So they got over here, and more specifically in our area, we have the Tlallam tribe, which really consists of about 34 different villages. 5 of those villages are over on Vancouver Island. So they would paddle on over to this area and vice versa for trading and different potlatches and things like that. But we had close to 30, probably 28 of them here, villages all the way out almost to Nia Bay, and then going all the way to
No, Kitsap, you think of Paulsbo area?
No, not quite as far. Port Gamble.
Port Gamble, okay, yeah.
So they'd be as far as Port Gamble. And then there's also the Chewitson village, which is an ancient burial ground, and that's right in town here, right in the harbor. And that was really a sore subject for a little while here back around 2005 when they tried to put in a facility there. But, I'm really proud of the community. They all kind of came together in the end, and no one wanted to see any of their ancestors, whether it's your grandfather or anyone ever in your history, to be unearthed. And so everyone kind of came together, and it is now it's an actual dedicated sacred tribal resting spot.
That's
right here in town.
Right here in town.
Yeah.
A couple interesting facts that I really like about the native tribes that are here and anywhere around the world is they were kind of our first land managers. We have land management in our culture now, but they've been doing this for 40,000 years, and most of it was due to hunting practices. But they would do local burns, and mostly it was the women in the tribe that were in charge of the land. They would do some burns so they could kind of herd where the animals went. They could make pathways or roadways by doing that, and they could prevent fires by getting rid of any of the loose firewood that might be around that could catch fire. So they were really quite brilliant, actually, when it came to land management, and we're getting there.
We got a few thousand more years to go to catch up.
That's for sure. Can you tell everyone a little bit about Port Angeles, when Port Angeles was established and how it was established?
I can go over that as well. It's fascinating, really. Don Francisco de Elias on the San Carlos came in 1791, but he was definitely not the first person around. Back in the 1500s, there were Spanish sailors coming out to the mouth of the straits, and that's very documented in different log journals from various captains. But 1791 is when Don Francisco Elias came in on the San Carlos, and he kind of got credit for finding it. The spit that we have here, which Mark mentioned, that the Coast Guard base is on, it didn't look like what it looks today. We have a lot of riprap on there. Most of the riprap was put on because when they dammed up the Elwha River, which fed the hook started disappearing. But back in the day when Don Francisco came, the hook was very hard to see. And with fog on it, which you've probably seen many times out on the strait with the fog, it was very hard to see. So that was probably why he was the first one. He actually came in a little closer. So he came in, and then a little later, there was less than 100 people. There was probably just a couple of dozen people here all the way until about 1852. And in 1852, they actually put out a navigational chart that had Port Angeles. It was called False Dungeness because everyone Dungeness was labeled as Squim.
Yeah.
So we were called False Dungeness. And the other thing that happened around that time, 1852, where steamboats were available, and sailing ships didn't like coming into the harbor here because it was hard to maneuver. But once the steamships came, it started bringing more people and more ships and more traffic into Port Angeles Harbor. So it started to grow a little bit. And then in 1859, there was what was called the Pig War, and that was over on the San Juan Islands. And that was really significant because with the Pig War, it brought a lot of British troops over to the San Juan Islands. And just a couple of years after that, when Abraham Lincoln became president, we knew the Civil War was going to go on. Victor Smith, who is appointed to this area in Puget Sound as the customs collector, and he operated the port of entry, he saw that as a big threat, having all of these British Navy ships and Army right over in the San Juans when we're going to go and fight a battle over on the East Coast, the Civil War. So he convinced Abraham Lincoln that we should have a military reservation here in Port Angeles. So just in case the British got any kind of fancy ideas about coming on over and making this, instead of a Washington territory, a British territory, he went ahead and convinced Abraham Lincoln that we should make this a military reservation. So June of 1862, Abraham Lincoln made this the second national city, which entirely, it just meant that the government would design the town.
The Army Corps of Engineers.
Correct.
Yeah.
So
it's the second because the first was Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And laid out by the Army Corps of Engineers. And so this was their second city that they were commissioned to lay out. The other point I wanted to add on to what Steve was saying is this whole territory was known as Columbia.
Yeah.
And that includes what's now Washington State.
Yeah.
And so when it was determined that this territory would be U.S. territory and now is Washington State, that is my understanding. That is why British Columbia is called British Columbia, because of the Columbia territory, a general area.
Yeah.
The parts that are Vancouver Island and then now Vancouver and that whole aspect of Canada is British Columbia, because there's, we'd otherwise be called United States Columbia and then British Columbia. So, yeah.
That's a bit of Canadian and American history that's connected. That's awesome.
Yeah, exactly.
So that went on for the next 50 or 60 years. There was probably less than 100 people here, just dozens of people, until about 1889 when Washington became a state, like Mark had said. And then in 1890, Port Angeles was actually founded, and they had they're incorporated actually, and they got their first mayor, John Dyke. And even more interesting, Norman Smith became the second mayor, and he was the son of Victor Smith. So Victor Smith was the founder, and then his son went to become the second mayor.
Okay.
And I just want to point out that the Port Angeles Chamber of Commerce was then established in 1894, just 4 years later. 4 years after the city was established, the Chamber of Commerce was established. So we've been around since 1894. Yeah.
That's great. The city decided to raise the streets due to the smell of sewage. Can you give us a little bit of backstory, how and why conditions came to be like that?
Absolutely. So prior to 1914, because of that military reserve, there was a very small amount of area that people could build a business or a house or anything like that. And it was basically the tide line. It was from the water to the bluff. Very small area, and that was all would be flooded. When the tide would come in, it would flood it. There was also two creeks that would run right down in the middle of that, and that would flood it as well. So there was an issue with the flooding in that area, but they had no choice. It was the only place that they could build. So any building that they put up had to be pretty much on stilts, had to be raised up. And what they would do what made that stink was they would have, for bathrooms, there's no plumbing, there's no electricity. They would have holes in the floorboards of these buildings, and you would just do your duty right in through the hole, and it would drop to the ground. And then when the tide went out, it would take it with it. The problem is when the tide came back in, because it was such a protected harbor, everything would come back in and settle out
over time.
Over time,
it kind of built up,
and that was the curse of Port Angeles, was that rancid smell, was the stink. So that was one of the main reasons they wanted to raise the town, was so they could put plumbing in, sewage, they could have electricity, and they could get out of that tide line. They actually had bridges from one side of the street to the other, walkways that people could walk across, because it was just such a flood zone. And I'm sure the folks didn't like water underneath their building as well.
True.
In the mud, so there was a lot of reasons they wanted to raise the street.
So the buildings were there. Some of them had first floor activity and that sort of thing. Some of them were just on stilts.
Yeah.
And so when they undertook to raise the streets, the whole idea was to raise the basic street, I guess the ground level above sea level, because at that point it was basically at sea level. So they needed to, and we're really just talking about the downtown area that's surrounded by the water and the bluff. As you go down into the bluff area, that's where all the businesses were that Steve's talking about. The rest of the town, of course, is way above sea level still today. But we're really just talking about the downtown Port Angeles area.
The downtown core.
Yeah.
In that process, did anyone end up with the infamous exploding toilets like in Seattle?
No, because we didn't have toilets. We had holes in the ground or in the floorboards.
Just a hole in the ground.
Yeah, so a hole in the floorboard.
You let the tide wash it in and out, but like I said, over time that works fine for a little while, but over a number of years, the tide can only do so much, in terms of flushing the waste out into the Straits of Juan de Fuca.
It's a sneaky proposition.
Yeah.
Can you tell everyone a little about how the downtown core was raised?
Yeah, they when they came up with the idea, there's two things kind of going on. The only way to really get into the downtown area was by ship. So they had several docks. There was a bluff that ran. It ran all the way out to Nia Bay and all the way out to Port Gamble. It's all bluff, and like I say, that's where the town was, is in between that water line and the bluff. And it was called a hogback, and a hogback is simply just an impassable hill or mountain that's low, and you have to climb to the top, and then you kind of go down to the other side. So that bluff was a hogback in that area, right around where Lincoln Street is now. It was called the hogback. So they needed to remove all of that dirt, because it went down on the other side, the south side of town. It would start to go back down. So they wanted to remove a large area of dirt. So that was the big thing, moving that so that people could come into town via a road. But they also wanted to raise the streets. So they kind of got the idea from Seattle using water cannons. And they would go ahead and just place the water cannons above the hogback, a little bit just further away from where they wanted to remove it. And they would just use the water cannons and blast all of that dirt down into the streets. But of course, by doing that, the sluice material that came down was
mud,
but it was a very liquefied mud. It was mostly water, probably 90% water, 10% dirt. And so it was going to go right into all of those buildings that were downtown. So they used the dam workers from the Elwha Dam. They had just completed their task of building the dam to build 15-foot tall, basically, walls that were the whole length of town, about 3,000 foot long. So you had these 15-foot tall walls, and they would go ahead and have one on each side of the street, and they would fill those with dirt from mud, the sluice material. And then they came up with a really creative way, which you would see in the tour through some of the photos and explanation of how to get rid of all of that water. But the mud would just settle in between those two concrete walls and then settle. And then they would just top it off with cedar planks when it was all dried up, leaving those concrete walls in there. And the cedar would go all the way from the buildings on the south side to the buildings on the north side, right up to the buildings. So part of them would be sidewalks and part would be the street. The sidewalks were hollow underneath though, because they didn't fill those with dirt. So all the original ground level parts of those buildings were now basements, and they were underneath the sidewalk, hence the underground tour.
And the sidewalk was a wooden sidewalk.
And it was wooden sidewalk.
A plank sidewalk.
Right. Yeah. Which was so was the street at the time. They didn't fill it with concrete. They didn't have concrete the streets in the beginning because there would be sinkholes. They needed to let it really cure for probably a good 5 or 6 years before they could put concrete. So they just ran planks all the way across. So they had the sidewalks and the road itself was all planked cedar. And that's kind of how they did it. Mm-hmm. They solved the problem of the hogback being in the way, and they were able to put in Lincoln Street running north and south so traffic could get in, and they raised the streets at the same time. So it was pretty creative.
That's ingenious.
Yeah.
But it created a network of underground, basically tunnels, where the sidewalks used to be. When they raised the street in the middle, and so the tour that we have actually takes you into that area where you can actually see some of those walls that still exist and some of the tunnels as well. Some of them you can still see, but some of them don't. Many of them don't exist anymore because they have since been filled in for safety reasons mostly.
But there is a great example that you will see on the tour that shows the wall, and it shows the windows of the building that was down below, which originally was ground level floors, that are now basement floors, and they have the windows still in them. There's skylights in the sidewalk, so you could see underneath. But it was quite they used it for illegal activity as well. That was used for smuggling liquor during Prohibition from 1920 to 1933. Most of that liquor coming from across the way there, Victoria.
Yeah.
Canadian whiskey, I'm guessing.
Yeah. Maybe even some Canadian beer.
Yeah.
Some little Labatt's, and Molson, right? Some Molson beer. So back in the Prohibition days, but they also use those tunnels for sailors and others who were trying to get to the brothel houses without being seen on the street. They could actually gain access to the brothel house through the underground tunnel, and that way they wouldn't be seen going in and out of the house of ill repute.
Houses of ill repute, yeah.
Mostly sailors.
Yeah, I don't know if the sailors really minded too much being seen. But there were prominent men in town that absolutely did not want to be seen going in there.
Right.
That's for sure. When they were in the process of construction, did anyone fall off of the wall areas?
You would think, but there's no history. There's nothing written anywhere about that. So I can't really answer that, but there's nothing. I've read a lot of the history, and I haven't seen any fatalities or injuries or anything of the sort.
I can imagine that'd be a little bit of a scary drop to walk out of your house a little bit tipsy and.
When you see the slideshow, the presentation show on the tour, it shows that. You can say it is. It's actually a miracle that they were able to do what they did in 1914. It could never be duplicated today. There was just so much. I mean, we have EPA, we have permits, we have OSHA, and that's a good thing, but we never would have gotten done what we got done.
Well, a lot of the reason why we were able to do it is because all of those engineers and laborers were here in the area to build that Elwha Dam, which they started in 1912, I think, and finished in 1914. So once they were done building that dam, they didn't have anything left to do except disperse back out into the world looking for jobs. But we had this work that needed to be done right here. And so they stayed and they got that work done.
That's excellent.
They had the equipment and the knowledge and the labor to get it done.
Do you guys have a Mason Lodge in town?
We do have a Mason Lodge. Yeah.
Those guys throughout history, some of the brightest engineers and builders were in the Mason halls and stonemasons.
Sure.
They know their stuff.
We have an actually pretty classic, neoclassic, large temple, a Mason temple building right on Lincoln Street here in Port Angeles. It's kind of an impressive looking building, actually. Of course, it's across the street from the Rite Aid, but it's still it's a historic, beautiful building, and the Masons still operate out of there today.
Awesome. How long has that been around?
Gosh, good question. I'm going to say right around 1920 or something. It seems like to me.
Yeah, it would have to be after 1914 because there really was nothing there before then.
Right.
They may have been here, but their establishment
about 100 years, I'd say. Yeah, somewhere there. Yep.
Can you give us a little history about the downtown hotel? We talked about this briefly before, and you said something about an exploding hotel. Can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, that would have been the.
Well, before you get started, you might want to talk about two hotels.
Okay.
You know, the one that exploded, but then also the one that's on the tour a little bit. You know, just kind of. I don't know.
The hotel on the tour.
Yeah, the Elwha Hotel. I mean, the Elwha
Theater.
I'm sorry. I'm talking theater. My bad. Yeah, my bad. I mixed up hotels and theaters. So yes. Sorry, Steve. Go ahead. So talk about the exploding hotel.
Does it once a week.
Right.
The Olympus Hotel. So it was originally a building called the Stork's Store, Samuel Stork's Store in the 1880s, and then it became an iconic place. It was the Opera House. And yeah, we had opera back then. 1891, that place was built by the Puget Sound Cooperative Colony. And then that was torn down in 1923, and that's in 1924 is when the Olympus Hotel was put there. And right next to it was the Hagwood Restaurant. So you had the hotel and the restaurant. And then in 1971, it exploded in the middle of the night. And it was related to natural gas that we used to have plumbed in. And my guess is the city probably had an issue with it as it was. There was probably a lot of issues with natural gas at the time that they were having to maintain, and they were probably losing sleep at night thinking about it. But sure enough, the hotel exploded, and one person was killed, not at the site of the scene, but about a couple of days later from injuries that he received from the explosion. So that was gone, and a year later in 1972, the city council went ahead and banned natural gas throughout the whole city. And it's still it's a parking lot now, so there's nothing there.
And we still don't have natural gas in this town.
Correct.
It's not allowed here. So
that's probably a good thing.
We have propane tanks everywhere, but none of the natural gas.
Yeah, and I doubt we'll ever get it. There's, San Francisco has blown up before. You know, Seattle just a couple of years ago, they had a whole street disappear. So, yeah.
Can you give? Well, we just talked about the theater. So
I can talk more about the theater.
Yeah, please.
So what Mark was referring to was the Elwha Theater that was built in the 30s. But what I like to usually talk on the tour about is before it was the Elwha Theater, it was called the Dream Theater. And they had them all around the country. And there was one place back on the East Coast that used to supply organs for all the Dream Theaters. So a Dream Theater was a black and white silent movie that they would show. And whenever a Dream Theater would get these movies in, it would come with a script, a music script. and it was for the organ player. So if there was a scary scene in the movie, in the silent movie, then the organ player would play something to simulate, to scare people.
Because they were silent movies.
They were silent movies. So the organ did all the talking. And it's funny because if you look in the archive from this organ facility that supplied all these organs throughout the country, every one of them has a date when the organ went out, and every one of them had a date when it came back. Port Angeles is the only city that it never came back. It went out in 1916 and never came back. Okay. So don't know what happened to it. But then the Elwha Theater was put in place, and on the tour we go through, and it's a really good attraction. A lot of people really like the theater. It's really quite amazing. It's got a good story, and you just have to kind of see it to believe it.
Yeah. Now it's a retail store, but the parts of it have been preserved, like the projection room and
the theater itself. You can see the ceiling.
They put in a false ceiling basically because it was a big expansive theater space, and then to make the store possible, they put in a false ceiling there.
Yeah, it's amazing how they did the silent films and added the sound via the organ.
And it would tell the story. It was really amazing. I don't know if you've ever seen one before, but
live music.
Yeah. It was great.
That'd be it served two purposes. You could have a little bit of a party there without the theater troupe or silent film. You could do pretty much anything in the hall.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Can you tell us a little bit about the wild days when Navy ships came to port? I think we talked briefly about this earlier.
Yeah, well, they came in 1895 when Admiral Beardsley came aboard. He was invited over and came up, and he saw our wonderful harbor, 150 feet deep, very large, 2.5 miles in one direction from end to end, and 2 miles in the other direction, north and south. So it was a big harbor, very protected. Admiral Beardsley fell in love with it and started bringing his entire fleet from 1895 all the way till 1935, and even a little bit further. By 1940, the Pacific Fleet was moved from San Diego to Honolulu. And once they moved to Honolulu, they definitely didn't come back over this way. It was just until World War II. Yeah. They were over there. So, but while they were here, there was definitely a lot of activity with the brothel. They did.
Oh, there's more than one brothel.
Yeah, they were yes. We go into one brothel. Yeah. There's still at least 2 brothels that I know of that are here.
Yeah. But not operating.
Not operating.
Yeah. Historic buildings. And the tour includes one of those brothels.
Absolutely. So, anyways, they would come here, and until about 1940, they were definitely gone until World War II. And I do have another story. Like I said, they were very with the brothel, but I do have another story which involves the Coast Guard. If you want me to talk about that, it involves the Navy. So there was before Pearl Harbor happened, in 1938, we had a captain, a new officer actually that showed up to the Coast Guard base in 1938, Captain Mac Ehrman, and they called him Captain Mac just because his name was so complicated. And when he got here in 38, he was just right out of flight school. But he was quickly made the commanding officer, especially right after Pearl Harbor. And so he was here, and he completely did not like being here. He hated being here. He wanted to go to the front line. He wanted action. And he kept writing his superiors every single day for a year, over a year. And they kept saying, no, you're not going to get transferred. You're not going to transfer. Finally, they told him, if you stop writing the stupid letters, we'll give you a promotion. And he turned the promotion down. But he didn't leave. He was left there. And he kept telling his superiors that all of his officers were completely incompetent. If they are ever sent on a mission, it always ends in failure. And they didn't believe him, so he wanted to prove his point. Well, not only was the Coast Guard on that base, but they also had a Navy intelligence building, and they also had a runway where they would train Navy officers how to fly and land on an aircraft carrier. It was a short runway, so it simulated an aircraft carrier. So he came up with a great idea. The admin building had two 325-pound bombs, one at each end. And if the Japanese invaded, which everyone thought they would, the whole West Coast was specifically set up to stop an invasion from the Japanese after Pearl Harbor. So Port Angeles was no different. That was their main mission, was to go on flight maneuvers and look for Japanese submarines or anything that indicated that they were going to invade. So he came up with this idea that he was going to fake an invasion. So he went ahead and grabbed a couple of his young junior petty officers and had one of them in the middle of the night empty all of the guns. They had Springfield rifles. So he went into all where the guns were and emptied all the ammunition. He was also tasked with putting dynamite all throughout the base and had to ignite it in the middle of the night when he was directed to. And then they also had diesel fuel on the runways that they were supposed to light. So he took his, Captain Mack took his amphibian plane. It was called it was a Grumman Goose. And he, in the middle of the night, flew out and had instructions for his petty officers to light off the dynamite and light fires on the runway as he kind of simulated a dive bomber coming in. Well, all of his officers did the right thing. They went ahead and notified Seattle that they were being attacked by the Japanese. So they went ahead and the entire West Coast went on full alert. They got all the ships underway. They got submarines underway. They got aircraft in the air. Everyone got ready for this invasion. Even the Navy that was here at the time in the harbor, they saw the explosion, saw him, Captain Mack, dive bombing the runway, and they all fired towards Captain Mack. And he got out of here. He didn't have any ammunition. He wasn't going to start shooting at the Navy. So he went out to Victoria.
He went to Canada.
And so anyways, long story short, in the very, very end, the one mission that the Coast Guard had was if they got overrun by the Japanese, they had to blow up with those 350-pound bombs, blow up the Navy intelligence office before they evacuated, which they did not do. So his story about them blowing the mission was accurate, but they did put the whole side of this West Coast side of the country under a full alert and created quite a scene.
For which he was court-martialed.
No, he wasn't. He actually, I don't know how he got out of it, but he actually did really well the rest of his career. And the admin building that is on the Coast Guard base right now is named after him.
Yeah.
That's interesting. You would think you would have been court-martialed for that.
But you sure would think so.
So one of the photos I sent you, Alan, has much of, if not all, most of the Pacific Fleet, the Navy Pacific Fleet in the Port Angeles Harbor, and it shows all the ships there. And this was in the months before they went to Pearl Harbor. So a lot of those ships didn't survive Pearl Harbor, actually, and this is one of the last ports that they stopped in on their way to Pearl Harbor.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another really interesting thing with those photos, it doesn't show it there, but in 1933, which was after they were probably getting ready to leave, the USS Constitution went on a worldwide tour, and they would get towed all over the world. And then when they got to the harbor, Port Angeles Harbor in 1933, they would sail in. So they actually came into Port Angeles here in the harbor in 1933. That's Old Ironsides. It's the USS Constitution, which is still an active ship in the military as we speak.
Okay. But you'd think an old ship like that wouldn't be still in service, but it's of historic value.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah, it was the granddaddy of ships in the War of 1812.
That was an interesting war. War of 1812. It's the only time that Canada, which wasn't Canada at the time, it was the British, and it's the only time that the border was breached by what would become Canada into the U.S. and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
And since then, we haven't had any problems. So, knock on wood.
The pig war.
Except for the pig war, right?
Pig war, yeah.
Yeah. And the pig war was interesting because it went on for 12 years, and the only thing that was ever shot at and killed was a pig. The troops never fought. It was a stalemate, or not a stalemate, but it was a standoff, and it was, they were both there for in case the other, side decided to act.
What time? Do you know exactly what time of year that the pig was killed?
No, but I know farming was involved, so the farmers were out, and then that was, the pig got shot because it was on eating the other farmer's crop, and the whole pig war started because it was like, okay, well, we're going to prosecute. So is it British territory or is it, United States territory? And they couldn't make up their mind, so that's when the troops were built up to until they could figure it out. But it took a good 12 years of the troops being there.
Oh. That's a significant amount of time for a pig.
Yeah.
That's right. Who shot the pig?
The city has reshaped itself over the years to survive. How is the city changing again to continue to survive?
Yeah, so I can talk to that. The early days that Steve was talking a lot about, it was really just shaping up to be a self-sustaining village area, not really connected that much to commerce, that much outside of the immediate area. But over time, it became pretty clear that we had a product here nearby that became pretty valuable, and that was timber. Mm-hmm. And so through the decades of the 20th century, the timber industry grew here pretty significantly. There was even a part of the 20th century where spruce was highly sought after because of its strength as a wood, but also its weight. So the strength to weight ratio was perfect for building airplanes. And so the U.S. government was buying a ton of spruce, and so that's something that we grow a lot of here, especially on the west side. So to get that spruce, closer to where we could ship it and railroad it out of here, they had to build a spruce railroad. And there still is today the railroad bed for the spruce railroad is now becoming the Olympic Discovery Trail, which is a 130-mile trail that goes really from Port Townsend all the way out to the Push on the west coast, on the Pacific coast. So it runs right through the downtown of Port Angeles, through Sequim, out past Forks, or goes around Lake Crescent. It's beautiful. There's a couple of tunnels that it went through out around Lake Crescent, and they're gorgeous. The trail, the 130 miles is not complete today, but they're working on it. And I think it's about 75% complete. And there's long segments that you can ride a bike or walk or run, or even they're allowed equestrian activities as well. So horses can go there too. But the timber industry grew here dramatically and still survives today. And having said that, right around the 1970s or so, early 80s, the timber industry started to dry up, much as the same way that it did in many other quote-unquote timber towns in the Pacific Northwest. Many of those towns are closer to being ghost towns today than they were back in their thriving days of when a lot of the timber harvest was creating lots of opportunity and dollars and commerce for the local towns. Mm-hmm. The thing about Port Angeles that's a little different is our connection to Victoria, frankly. The Black Ball Ferry that was started here in the 20th century, early 20th century, still runs today. And that's an important international bridge, if you will, between the United States and Canada. And so Port Angeles as a town has been bolstered economically through the decades that the timber industry has dried up, by that sea bridge, basically between the towns. In addition to that, the Olympic National Park, our proximity to it, it's basically our backyard.
Yeah.
And the wilderness that it presents, and all the other amazing things about the Olympic National Park, that bring in today 3.5 million people a year to visit the park, also keeps this town from having the same fate as a lot of the other Pacific Northwest towns who lost their timber industry for the most part. But having said that, this community has pivoted away pretty much from timber. We still ship a lot of timber out of here, primarily to China, but and there are quite a few jobs related to that, but nothing like in the past. And we also have a mill here that opened up about 3 years ago now. I think it must be the only paper mill that's opened up in the last 20 years anywhere in the Pacific Northwest, because they're not opening up, they're actually closing up.
Yeah.
But our paper mill actually opened up 3 years ago. It's the McKinley paper mill. It's actually owned by a company out of Mexico that is dedicated to ecological endeavors, especially with regard to sustainable paper products and recyclable paper, taking recyclable cardboard and turning it into paper products is kind of their specialty. Yeah. So they have, I think, about 150 people employed out there today, and just started up a few years ago. So we're pretty proud of that. But that doesn't mean we're strong in timber and paper industry here. It's still a player for sure. But our pivot is really more toward the hospitality and tourism world. And when you speak of tourism, for us, it comes mostly in the nature of outdoor recreation.
Yeah.
So mainly because the Olympic National Park is right here, rivers, lakes, trails, ocean, alpine, rainforest, just the diversity of outdoor activities here is amazing. We also benefit greatly from the fact that we're a temperate climate. So it doesn't get real cold here in the winter, and it doesn't get real hot in the summer. And so it's really pretty easy to be outside here. People here live outside pretty much all the time. We're very much outdoor people. We don't have air conditioners, and we don't have sophisticated heaters. Many people just heat their homes with wood, or electricity from the Bonneville Dam. So our heat is really clean power, and we're outdoor people, lovers of nature, enjoy the mountains and the sea, and we're just really lucky to live here. But tourists come from all over, and we're slammed at the moment while I'm speaking to you. There's our hotels are full, our Airbnbs are full, our VRBOs are full, and people just love coming here in July, August, and September. So we're working economically to expand the attraction of Port Angeles to tourists throughout the whole year, and not just in these beautiful precipitation-free months of July and August and September, where we get very, very little rain in those 3 months. So that's our pivot. That's kind of how the community has economically changed over time, away from timber to now pretty much predominantly tourism. So
is Crab Fest a part of that?
Absolutely. Crab Fest was set up by the Chamber and a couple other entities about 15 years ago? I think it's been going on. And they set it up to coincide with the Canadian Thanksgiving, actually. And the part of the reason for that is not only to help celebrate with Canadians and get Canadians to come down here, but also to put it in a time of year when we don't have, an influx of over tourism, basically. So that's why it's in October, and it's connected to the Canadian Thanksgiving, and we get extra loads of Canadians coming in for the amazing seafood and the Dungeness crab.
Excellent. Can you tell us a little bit about the Underground Heritage Tour, please?
Yeah, so the Underground Tour was established, I think about 15 years ago or so, 12, 15 years ago, by some city leaders of our community who recognized that there was an interesting story there, and they wanted to preserve the story of really what Steve kind of went through, which is kind of, how the tunnels got built in the first place, and then they wanted to preserve that history and that story. And so there's a gentleman by the name of Jackson Smart who still does gives the tour once in a while, but not so much anymore. And another gentleman by the name of Don Perry, who worked together to develop this tour and really this story that it lasts about 2 hours. It starts out with a slideshow and sort of an explanation of what you're going to see and why it's there, and then an actual walking tour where they take you down into the tunnel areas and upstairs into the brothel, and you get to go see the theater, the projection room and the old Elwha Theater and that sort of thing. So Don Perry did that for a while. He then decided a few years back that I guess about 5 or 6 years ago, he decided that he was getting too old to continue doing it all the time and running it as a business. He kind of ran it as a business, side business. It wasn't a serious income generator for him, but it was enough to kind of keep him inspired to do it. But then he decided he wanted to retire, so he actually sold the tour to the Blackball Ferry Company, and Blackball Ferry didn't really want to run the tour. They just wanted to make sure it didn't go away because they bought it for a very modest sum just to make sure that they could keep it going. And they had a couple of different tour operators that ran it for them. They didn't get involved in running it at all over a couple of years. And then COVID hit a couple of years ago, as you know, and some of those tour operators we lost either through they just passed away from old age, or they moved out of town for economical reasons, that type of thing. So they're gone, and the Blackball is still sitting there with the tour and nothing to do with it. So they talked to me and said, would the Chamber of Commerce be interested in operating this tour, because we don't want it to go away, and it's a great story. It's a great tour. It gets great ratings on TripAdvisor, and really all the reviews we get for it are always glowing. So we agreed to go ahead and see if we could preserve the tour and keep it going. And so we reached out to a couple of tour guides, and thankfully Steve, who's been telling you the history, stepped in with his historical knowledge and his enthusiasm about the history of our area. And a couple of other tour guides that we have make it possible for us to do the tour.
Excellent. Do you guys have anything that you would like to promote that's coming up with anything to do with the area?
Well, I can say that right now we only have a couple of tour guides, so we are only able to do the tour on Fridays and Saturdays.
Okay.
In the future, we hope to expand it to Tuesday through Saturday. Okay. We're not able to do Sundays and Mondays just because of access to some of the locations that we'd like to take people on. But eventually, it is going to be a 5 days a week tour. But right now, if people are interested in going on the tour, you can book actually through Blackball. If you're Canadian, you can save on the price of your your Blackball ticket, as well as your ticket for the Underground Tour, by doing it as a package. So you can buy you can buy a package tour for Canadians, can come and save a little bit of money on the deal and do the tour that way. If you book it through Blackball. If you just are here, or American, or just somebody local, and you want to take the tour, or a visitor from another country, it doesn't matter if you're here. You can book it on PortAngelesHeritageTours.com,
Okay.
or just Google Port Angeles Underground or Port Angeles Heritage, and you'll get the link to the first results. And it's $15 for adults, and it's great entertainment for 2 hours.
Yeah.
It's a little less expensive for seniors and students and little kids and things like that, but the high water price for adults is $15.
That's not too bad. For the amount of history and the locations, I've done the tour, so it's kind of remembering the walking bit. There was mention of a boxer who trained in one of the underground areas for a while, but I'm not sure who that was. I'll have to look at my notes. I'll put that in the show notes afterwards and send you a copy of that.
All right. Yeah. Don loved telling that story.
Yeah.
It was about a kid.
Well, I think.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think you're talking that there was actually somebody that became a world, maybe not a world champion, but a contender of some sort that boxed with the police department. What Mark is referring to is a child that was in school that got in trouble for being the town bully.
Yeah.
And he would go down there. The police kind of took him in, and they would take him down there, and he would box. And he went on after his year of probation, went on to become a police officer, and then eventually went on to become the chief of police. And so there's actually two separate stories. But there was a gentleman that was a famous boxer of some sort that actually did come to town here.
And where the boxing ring is located is in the underground area. That's
on the tour.
That's what you remember, and that's part of the tour. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much for coming on with us today.
Yeah, no problem. Very nice, Alan. Thank you.
Thank you. I wish to thank our guests, Mark and Steve, for coming on with us. It was a fun conversation and a great bit of local and international history. We visit Port Angeles often and recommend visiting its many bookstores, gift shops, and markets. There are great restaurants and a quirky pizzeria within walking distance of the waterfront. If you have a chance to explore Port Angeles, take your time, stay for a bit, and explore what this city has to offer. That's all for now. Please like, follow, and subscribe on whatever platform you listen on, and we'll see you soon.